So that was awesome. Good morning, church. So good to see you. Happy Mother's Day to all you moms. I hope today is memorable and meaningful and filled with lots and lots of love and lots and lots and lots of chocolate. Chocolate makes everything better. Amen? Well, today's story in Scripture isn't actually automatically attached to last week's. This actually takes place, the story that Daisy read for us, takes place 4 months after last week's sermon. If you can remember all the way back to last week, that's when we were introduced to this character, Nehemiah. It's really his memoir that we're reading and studying together over the next month. And Nehemiah is a high-ranking official in a foreign court. And if you can remember back to the story in chapter 1, his brother Hananiah and some missionaries from Jerusalem have come back to Susa, and they've brought with them this really negative, disappointing, discouraging report of how things are going in Jerusalem. About 40,000 people, Jewish people, have returned from exile to Jerusalem to begin to try to rebuild this capital city that's at the very center of their identity as a people, where they worship, where their temple is, where their history is, where their fathers' graves are. But things aren't going well. They have no money, no resources, no ability to rebuild their walls and to rebuild their gates. And if you can remember back to the story last week, Nehemiah is deeply impacted by the story, by the report that he hears. And so he gives himself over to prayer and to fasting and to mourning and to really seeking the Lord. And then Nehemiah gets a word, he gets a plan, he gets a sense of vision of what God wants him to do. But then he doesn't do anything. And he waits for 4 months. Now, 4 months to us in our modern world, it probably seems like an eternity. He waits for 4 months. But here's the thing, Nehemiah has to wait until the perfect time to unleash his plan. When it comes to following God and operating within God's will and work in the world, there's a really important theology of time. We have to pay attention to God's timing. Everything has a very specific time. Last week, I was driving up to Riverview along Nicholson Road from way down south where I live in Harrisdale. I was making my way up the road and it started to rain. Now, I didn't know this and nobody had warned me, but Australians don't like driving in the rain. And it's not really their forte. So here's one of the things I discovered. I grew up in a country where it rains all the time. Like it just rains every day in Ireland. So you're used to driving in the rain. For us, it feels kind of scary to be driving on dry roads. You're like, what is this? Friction? What's that all about? And then I moved to Canada, where Canadians can drive in 4 feet of snow. Like there could be 4 feet of snow on the ground, Canadians get into their car and drive to work. But if it rains in Canada, like even 3 or 4 millimeters, it's like an episode of Wacky Races. Okay, it's nuts. And then I get to Australia and I'm kind of picking up a similar vibe. You know, you guys have these big 4-wheel drive vehicles and you can go off-road and drive in the craziest terrain ever, but a little bit of rain. Well, I gotta tell you, so I'm driving up Nicholson Road, and the heavens open, and it starts pouring down with the rain, and everyone else is probably grumpy, and the Irish guy's like, yes, it's raining. I love rain. So good. And as I'm driving up the road, there was a lady who was about to turn across our lanes of traffic, and she just got the timing all wrong. And maybe it was a visibility thing. Maybe it was a wet thing with the ground being wet. Whatever it was, she turned into the oncoming traffic. And I looked up out of the side of my window and I could see her car coming right into the side of mine. And I kid you not, I closed my eyes and braced for impact and squeezed my steering wheel. And then I heard a massive bang! But I didn't feel anything. So I thought, okay, I'm in heaven. But what had happened was in that 1 second of me closing my eyes, there was a car in the outside lane beside me that actually moved into that space. Now, thankfully, it was one of those big, Prada, big kind of massive 4-wheel drive vehicles with the big kangaroo killers on the front. I don't know what they're called. In North America, they're bull bars because you're afraid of running into a cow. But here I realize they're just a tactical weapon for surviving on the roads in Western Australia. But the lady crashed into the front of that. And thankfully, the only damage, I think, was to her pride. But as I reflected on that moment, I was like, what a difference a split second makes. I don't know if you've ever thought about your life and your story being a story of time. timing really matters. And the story of Nehemiah is actually a series of lessons about timing, about knowing when to act, when to speak, when to listen, when to pray, when to challenge, when to encourage, when to chastise, when to build up, when to be bold, when to be gentle. You see, the practice of knowing when is actually an important theme within the practice of the Christian faith. We actually don't have a right as Christians to live our lives doing whatever we want when we want. We live our lives paying attention to a God who is at work and trying to connect our lives and our story and the times, our days and our times to His, so that we can be in time with what He's doing in the world. Now, let me show you how this isn't just as deeply spiritual as it might sound from the story of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah gets this burden on his heart, right? He has to do this thing for God's people, and we get to know because we're reading back into the story that he's going to rebuild the walls, but nobody else knows. That's a secret. It's on his heart, and he hasn't told anyone. Okay, but this is his burden to carry. And he waits for 4 months before he moves to action. Now, why? Why would he wait for 4 months? Well, for him, it's not because he has like a supernatural connection to God's plan. He's actually trying to figure all this stuff out. Just like you and me, he's just an ordinary bloke. He's just the sort of guy who gets up, goes to the gym, goes to work, goes to the beach, is getting on with his life. But he's trying to do that in partnership with God and with God's Spirit. And so he waits for 4 months. Now, there's some very practical reasons. We know that King Artaxerxes would have gone to his other palace for the winter, and so he was gone for a bunch of those months. We know that Nehemiah has to be very careful about asking the king, because this is actually the same king who just in the book before, in the book of Ezra, the same king had actually stopped the rebuilding program in Jerusalem. So you might not know this, but there was another man called Ezra who went back to Jerusalem, and his job was to rebuild the temple. And so all the people started rebuilding the temple, but then there were spies who reported back to King Artaxerxes and said, oh, no, you don't want to give the people in Jerusalem any power or influence, because that's a rebellious city. They have a long history of rebelling against the kings that have taken over them. And so Artaxerxes had actually written a letter, a royal decree to the people in Jerusalem, forbidding them from building. So now Nehemiah has to think about this. It's like, how am I going to ask this king to allow me to go rebuild walls when the very same king has said, you're not allowed to rebuild the temple? In other words, how am I going to go before a king and say, can you change your mind? Okay, so you got like these different kind of leadership challenges that Nehemiah is facing. He also, maybe there's some wisdom in waiting until the party season. So that's what it is. King Artaxerxes has come back to Susa, back to this particular palace, just in time for party season. And so we were read in the scriptures that wine was before him. In other words, it was a feast, it was a festival. There was wine, and as Western Australians know, when there's wine, people are in a better mood, right? And so the king's probably in a better mood, so that might be a better time to ask him about rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem. And then not only that, we're told in the story that the queen is there. His wife is actually sitting beside him. And all men make better decisions when their wives are sitting beside them. We know this, right? This is proven. History has proven this. And actually, if you know Persian history, you'll know that the queen actually had an incredibly influential voice. Just think about the story of Esther. Esther was actually a part of this story as well, if you're familiar with Old Testament history. And so you've got Nehemiah who's weighing up all these different, very practical, very human factors. Okay, you got a king who's traveling, then you got to wait for the right time so you can approach him about a political decision. You know, you've got all these things going on. And Nehemiah knows when it's the right time. And at the right time, he steps in and he goes before the king. Now, that's one side of the story of timing. Let me just tell you the other side of this. And some of you are just going to think, this is so random, Steve. I'm never coming back. And that's okay. Because I know that talking about Bible prophecy is a no-no in the modern church. Okay? And I have so much PTSD and trauma from growing up in that world. When you went to church and people had charts to tell you about when Jesus was coming back and everybody was living in fear of the rapture. Those were great days. Lots of people got saved in those days. Let me just share this one thing with you, because I think it is really important and connected to Nehemiah's story. In another book in the Bible, the book of Daniel, which you might be familiar with, Beautiful book about a group of young men finding their way in a foreign court under King Nebuchadnezzar. But then Daniel, if you know the story, gets very weird very quickly and becomes a book about end times and prophecy, and nobody reads that part because it's very confusing. But in Daniel chapter 9, an angel of the Lord comes to meet with Daniel. Daniel's praying, and this angel shows up, and the angel actually speaks to Daniel and gives him a prophecy about the future of the world. And in the prophecy, he tells the story of what's happening to Nehemiah. Because he tells the story about when the king, which is King Artaxerxes, issues his royal decree to allow Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. When he does this, that's going to kickstart a prophetic timeline that's going to take place, that's going to be unleashed in the world. Okay, and so there's all this kind of prophetic language, which is very hard for us to understand. There's this number of weeks, 70 weeks, 69 weeks. You've got all these things going on. But basically, most scholars agree that a week is actually 7 years. And so if you do all the mathematics, okay, which I had to do it on a calculator. By the way, I can't do it just on a piece of paper. It comes to 173,880 days. So once Nehemiah goes before the king, and the king says, yes, you can go to Jerusalem, a clock starts. And that clock rolls out for the next 173,880 days. And the angel actually says to Daniel at the starting of this clock, when the time is up, the prince will come. The prince who will lead will come. Now here's the really thing. When you put all those dates together, guess what happens after 173,880 days? King Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now that's a big wow moment, right? That's a huge moment. Now I'm not telling you that because I want you to get excited about end times theology, okay? And for us to go back to putting charts up on screens. But why I am telling you that is I think it illustrates the fact that Nehemiah is just an ordinary person like you and I trying to live in obedience, paying attention to God in his waking, working, everyday life, in his eating, drinking, going to sleep, normal life like you and me. He's trying to be obedient to God. And there's something about how God works in his sovereign grace that he invites our stories into his story. And so it really bodes on us well as Jesus followers to pay attention to the days and weeks and months and hours of our lives and to think about time. Because what's true of Nehemiah, I believe, is true of us. Nehemiah had no idea when he went before the king that day, when he waited for those 4 months, when he prayed and fasted and tried to discern how was God going to use him and how was he going to figure this out, that his story would be connected to Jesus's. He just had no idea about that whatsoever. Now, the whole story of Nehemiah offers us as a community a vision for our waking, sleeping, working, worshiping, everyday life on mission together. Over the last few months, I've been working with Tanya and Ryan and the staff here at Riverview, really get a sense of vision and direction for the future of our church. And God has been speaking and nudging us along and giving us little moments of direction and clarity. And we're pretty close to being able to come before you guys and say, hey, this is where we think God is leading us. Do you want to come? We're going to go. Will you come with us? That invitation is near, but not quite yet. But one of the central ideas that is emerging from this vision is the idea of Riverview being a deeply formed church. A deeply formed church. What might it look like to be a deeply formed people, to be a deeply formed community, growing deep into God, being deeply formed as maturing Christians living in the world? Now, listen, I know I've only been here a few months, but I know if anybody knows about digging deep, it's the people of Western Australia. One Western Australian said to another, I pulled a muscle digging for gold. His friend asked, was it bad? He said, no, it was just a minor injury. You can't do a Mother's Day without a dad joke. What does it look like to be a deeply formed community? I think the story of Nehemiah, and particularly chapter 2 that we've read together today, is actually a story of a deeply formed man, deeply formed person. And here's what I know to be true. Deeply formed communities don't just happen by magic. They're actually the collective of deeply formed individuals. Deeply formed people form deeply formed communities. So in so many ways, it starts with us. To pay attention to Nehemiah is wisdom for us. Nehemiah is a man of deep calling, deep character, and deep conviction. And I believe these are the three ingredients that lead to a deeply formed life. Let me talk about these just briefly this morning. Firstly, our calling. Here's something you need to know. I passionately believe with all my heart that every follower of Jesus has a calling on their lives. That we are all ministers of the gospel, all of us collectively. We don't go to church, we are the church, and we are all, every one of us, if we're a follower of Jesus, a minister of the gospel. We're all called. And our calling equips us to operate in a culture of fear with a mindset of courage. And that's what we learn from the story of Nehemiah. You see, Nehemiah was living and functioning under the reign of a Persian king. And I know the Persian kings, they got a lot of positive spin on their leadership because they allowed religious freedom. So when the Persians came to reign in world history, they allowed everybody, all the captives from all the kingdoms, to return home to worship their own gods. And so they got a lot of votes, a lot of public positive press because of their stance on religious freedom. And we know from Plutarch, who was a historian, that Artaxerxes was a gentle and a noble king. But that's only half the story. He doesn't mention the fact that Artaxerxes murdered his own brother in order to become king. And actually, the Persian kings were brutal and ruthless. And how they went after their people, on one hand, they gave them religious freedom, which everybody always thinks is the epitome of godly governance. But it's just a tactic as well, because on the other hand, they taxed their people into absolute starvation and poverty. Something for us to always think about, this whole idea of religious freedom. Do you know who else reigned the world with religious freedom? Genghis Khan. And so it's always something to think about. It's still just a political move. And Nehemiah is functioning in a culture of fear. I think that's something that we might know a thing or two about in our world today. A world governed by fear. And that was the world of Nehemiah. Working and walking around a king like Artaxerxes was like walking on eggshells. Now, some of you know the walking on eggshells experience. Okay, for some of us, we can imagine that, thinking through maybe the filter of how we imagine life is in North Korea or Russia. For some of us, maybe it's our marriage, walking on eggshells, not wanting to, you know that feeling. And that was Nehemiah. He was operating in a culture of fear. And yet that fear did not stop him stepping in to his calling, which was this holy burden that God did in his life and put in his heart to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. At the end of the day, Nehemiah received an invitation to put his life into God's bigger story. That's what a calling is. And that's why I believe every single one of us, if we're a Jesus follower, has a calling on our lives, because we're all extended an invitation to enter our lives and put our lives into his bigger story. And our calling equips us to operate in that story, which right now is in a culture of fear, but to do it not as a fear-based people, but as a courageous people. I had an actual real-life Book of Nehemiah moment this week. I called a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Paul, who's a missionary in Romania. Paul and I studied together, worked together in Canada. And 8 years ago, his wife and himself gave up their careers to go and work in northern Romania to build a camp ministry from scratch to serve the young people of northern Romania. And next year, one of the ideas that I had alongside some of our other staff, I said to the staff, would it be okay if we maybe organized a family camp for Riverview? And everyone was very excited about that. Now, that was very strategic on my part. Basically, I'm terrified to go camping. So I kind of figured, what if I got 100 or so other people to go with us? And I made it look really spiritual by suggesting we do it as a church. But anyway, I had thought, you know what? Paul would be the perfect guy to bring in to speak at camp. He's been doing camp ministry in North America for 20 years now in Romania, and he's such a passionate and excitable guy. I'd love to bring him in to lead our first family camp. And so I set up a Zoom call with him. Whenever I got on the call with Paul, instead of finding this exuberant, passionate leader that I've known for so long, I just found this guy that was just like Nehemiah. His face was sad. You could just feel the burden that he was carrying. And I was like, Paul, what's going on? You see, in my kind of ignorance and stupidity and laziness, I totally forgot that northern Romania is actually on the border of southern Ukraine. And so Paul's ministry to youth at camp has recently become ministry to Ukrainian refugees. And he was telling me the stories of the last few months and weeks for him as he's been driving missions back and forward into Ukraine to rescue people and bring them across the border to take aid and food and goods, and the stories that he has been caught up in. And I'm having this real life Nehemiah experience with him. And I said, well, what about this last week? What have you been up to this last week? He says, well, actually, I was driving across the border into Ukraine. I was taking a bunch of supplies, and I met up with a bunch of Baptist pastors. And you might not know this, but the Baptist church in Ukraine is so on fire for God. It's like unreal what's happening there. And I said, well, what happened when you were there? He says, well, while I was there, he said, I was just pulling up to the place, and they asked me if I would come in and preach. And he said, just as I agreed to come in and preach, the bomb sirens started wailing across the city, and everyone's running for cover. And I said, so what did you go home? He says, no, we all went into church. And I said, well, did you hunker down in church? No, we all worshiped in church. And I said, well, what did you do? He says, I preached. And he told me the story of ministering in this church in Ukraine in the middle of this war. And it just reminded me of this outrageous idea that our calling equips us to operate in a culture of fear with a mindset of courage. And the question I'm reflecting on, and invite you to do the same, is what would it look like for us at Riverview Church to live out that sort of calling here in Perth, in Western Australia, and the world around us? Now, Nehemiah doesn't just demonstrate his calling for us, he also demonstrates the power of living out of deeply formed character. I know you know this, but just in case you don't, character is a really big deal. And particularly for our witness in the modern world. That's where we failed immensely in the modern church, is in the depth of our character and the connection to our witness. Our character equips us to live with wisdom and beauty and peace and unity in a world that's divided and filled with hatred. I know I'm not the only one that spends 10 minutes on their social media and then just buries their head against the table and just thinks, how are we going to turn around from this? Our world is so angry and so filled with bitterness and hatred and division, and it's getting worse and worse, and I can't even begin to imagine how does the church live in this space. And I'm brought back to this. Our character matters. Nehemiah's world was a world just like ours, and yet one of the ways that we see Nehemiah operate in that world was by practicing character and by living out wisdom. In the story that Daisy read for us, we see how Nehemiah engages with political leadership. We see how he engages with his bosses. We see how he engages with the world around him. He listens more than he speaks. He pays attention to the words that he uses. Words are important. We know this. Why do we just throw them around? Why are we just permanently verbally barfing over the world? Our words are so important to us. What's really interesting about Nehemiah here is, even though, like in the version that Daisy read for us, that was a great translation, they use the word Jerusalem a lot, but actually in the original text, Nehemiah doesn't use the word Jerusalem at all. He has a conversation with the king about Jerusalem without talking about Jerusalem, because he knows that the king has issues with Jerusalem. And so instead, he uses his words tactically to engage him. He actually says this: I want to go back to the town, to the place where the graves of our fathers are. And that seems like a bit of a throwaway comment, but it's actually really not. Because you see, up until this moment, the Persians, when people died in Persia, do you know what they did? Nothing. They literally set their bodies outside because they believed their spirits had gone, and they left their bodies outside for the wild animals. Now, Artaxerxes is part of a new group of Persian rulers and kings that have emerged that have a different understanding about what you should do with people after they pass away. And so the first group of leaders within Persia to start burying people. And so this was something that he held dearly as a king, was that after someone dies, they should be buried somewhere. And it's to this passion that Artaxerxes holds that Nehemiah speaks. You see how much wisdom he practices and how he engages with that king. Okay, he thinks about the words that he uses. That's what it means to practice wisdom in our world. And we see when he gets to Jerusalem, rather than just rolling in as the big dog, he goes in and he spends 3 days just listening, paying attention, hearing the stories, connecting to what God's up to, making sure that what he does is he functions as a man of character, living out wisdom and beauty and peace. He casts a vision for a better future. He calls the best out of people. He speaks to what is good. Look at his personal interactions. They are filled and flavored with character. One of the things that I'm starting to understand more and more, probably as I get into middle age, but just more and more as I lead and follow Jesus, is that a deeply formed community is a community that practices godly character. In other words, okay, this is where the rubber hits the road. In other words, our mission for Jesus should taste and smell and feel like Jesus. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it should be evident. The fruit of his work in our lives. When the world encounters the church, here's what they should encounter: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, and self-control. That's the fruit of Jesus, the evidence of Jesus in the midst of his people. That is what it is to have biblical character. And I know there's a few naysayers that are right now, they're like, oh, no, Steve, that just sounds like wishy-washy, nice Christianity. But can I just be the kind of truth teller to say that, no, that's biblical Christianity. The Bible is very clear that the evidence of the Spirit's work in the community of faith is the evident presence of the character of Jesus. Love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, self-control. Not anger, not bitterness, not gossip, not jealousy, not divisiveness, not judgment, not misery, but Jesus. Love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, self-control. I think that's what it means to be a people of character. Now, here's the challenge. This is the really hard part, is that the character of a community is made up by the characters in the community. Okay? The character of the community is made up by the characters in the community. So I think we all have work to do in this area. Amen? Amen. Okay, here's the last thing that I want to say. Nehemiah teaches us what it means to live with calling and character. And here's the last thing that I think makes up a community that's deeply formed, and it's this: conviction. Conviction equips us to live with resilience and to love with compassion. Nehemiah is a man of conviction. Okay, when the hits came, which they did, okay, we read about it in today's story, and as you read the book of Nehemiah, you're going to discover that probably most of the rest of the text is a story of dealing with opposition. Nehemiah is a man of conviction, and he teaches us how to deal with that opposition. When the challenges appear and the opponents rise up, Nehemiah leaned into his convictions. And when you lean into your convictions, you can't be shaken. You can't be. Now, it seems to Nehemiah that there are two really core convictions that he holds. His first conviction is this: that the people of Judah were his people, and they were in the work together. And we see that it's especially true in the Hebrew language. It doesn't necessarily come across in our English Bibles. But the fact that Nehemiah chooses, when he speaks to his people in Jerusalem, he chooses to identify with them. He uses the word, we have the English word, we. I am part of you. You are part of me. We are in this together. That is a deeply held conviction that Nehemiah had. Even though he was a leader, he was not a lone wolf. Even though he was a leader, he was not different to the people on the ground around him. Even though he was a leader, his place was among his people. This is a deeply held conviction. Even though they were in great trouble, he said, we're in great trouble. The second conviction that Nehemiah holds is around his identity and the identity of God's people. Because whenever the people are booed and hissed and made fun of, he rises up, and this is what he says: the God of heaven will give us success, and we, his servants, will start rebuilding. This is about identity. Nehemiah had a deeply held conviction around his identity and the identity of God's people, who they were and who their God was. You know, I think that as Christians, we often have a dysfunctional understanding of what it means to live out our convictions. I think a deeply formed community, and please, I look forward to your feedback on this. I think a deeply formed community needs to have deeply formed and deeply held convictions. Okay, I actually believe that. But here's the thing. Those convictions are not for weaponizing, they are for stabilizing. That's the difference. Not for weaponizing, but for stabilizing. Life with God always involves taking hits. Every generation of Jesus followers will take hits. Culturally, practically, theologically. Hey, sometimes we deserve to get hit. You know, sometimes we deserve it. Other times, we're just easy targets. Our convictions are like our core muscles. They give us the ability to stand strong. Let me finish with a true story, okay? Not that all the other stories weren't true. But when I would walk home from school, when I was at high school, every day my walk home was fraught with danger. I mean, like serious danger. I had to walk through the notorious Orangefield Park. Now, Orangefield Park was flanked by two high schools. One was a grammar school, which in the British system is considered posh, fancy. They played rugby. They had great academics, fancy uniforms. All the posh and rich people went to grammar schools. Now, let me just be clear. That's the one that I went to, okay? That's because just in case that wasn't going to be obvious. The other school hated us. And so almost every day of my life, as I made my way home through Orangefield Park, I got chased home by huge crowds of students from the other school. And two things saved me. I can stand here today because two things saved me. Number one, excellent cardiovascular endurance. And number two, the fact that my grandparents, my wee Granny Flo and my Granda Tommy, lived at, and I kid you not, number 1 Orangefield Park. Their house was right at the gates of the park. I knew every day as I got chased through that park, if I could just make it to the gates, I would live to be fancy and posh for another day. One day, I'm making my way home, and I'm late because I've been at rugby practice, and it's already dark as I get into the park. And I've got my school bag on, I've got a big heavy rugby bag, I've got my technology folder and my lunch bag, my hands are filled. I've got no way to defend myself, but I'm like, I think it's okay, it's already dark. And I make my way into the park, when out from behind a tree jumped 4 students. And I was exhausted, and I had nowhere to go, and I was just like, this is it. This is where I die in Orangefield Park this day. And they're gonna find me in a bush 7 years from now. And here's what happened. The smallest guy in the group, who's always acting the big man, that's the way we say it in Ireland, he's the big man. He jumps towards me, lunges towards me, lifts his fist, and he punches me through the air. He was like flew through it, punched me in the side of the head as hard as he could. Crunch, crack, and that wasn't my head. I heard the bones in his hand shatter. And he fell to the ground and was screaming. And the other 3 guys with him looked at me. I think they thought I was some sort of student RoboCop. And they ran away. Now, let me explain what happened that day. It's not that I have an exceptionally hard head. But I was just making my way home from 90 minutes of rugby practice, where for 90 minutes I had been doing nothing apart from conditioning and fitness. Let me tell you what conditioning is in rugby. It's basically standing for 60 minutes and letting your teammates hit you as hard as they can. You tackle and you ruck and you tackle and you ruck and you hit and you hit and you hit and you hit. And the point is that you're conditioning your body for contact. And then on top of all that, when you're absolutely exhausted, your coach makes you lie on the ground and do hundreds and hundreds of sit-ups and push-ups so that your core is rock solid and strong, so that in rugby, in the game, when you take a hit, You can stand. And on this particular day, I'm walking home and this guy jumps out and he clocks me and I didn't move an inch because at the end of that day, what was another punch? It was nothing. That's like our convictions at the core of who we are. They give us the ability to stand strong and to stand firm. And at the end of the day, that's what the church is called to do. And so our convictions, which I hope at Riverview we have many, and they should all be centered around Jesus and who he is and what he teaches and the work that he's done for us and the cross and the resurrection. The core should be the core, right? The core should be the core. Our convictions equip us to live with resilience and love with compassion. Now, I have to tell you, after that incident, I became known as the second best fighter in my school. There was one other guy who'd been in a fight. Don't even know if he won, but he'd been in a real fight, so he became the best fighter in our school. A deeply formed community should have deeply formed convictions, no doubt about that. But they're not to be weaponized. They're for stabilizing. Things that are immovable, things that help us to stand strong. Listen, Nehemiah, I want you to go home and read Nehemiah 2 again, reflect on this. Nehemiah is a man of deep calling, deep character, and deep conviction. And I think that story serves us as a window of what it might look like to become a deeply formed community, a people of calling. Right? In a world where what would it look like to be a people? How prophetic would that be? To be a people who know what we're about because we've been called by God. To be a people of character. In a world of filters, to be a people of substance. To be a people of depth, wisdom, beauty, and unity, wholeness. And to be a people of conviction. Not whacking the world with our convictions, but dialing into them and being strong in them so that when the hits come, which they always will, we will stand. And then we will stand. And then when all else is done, guess what we'll do? We'll stand. Amen.